Church. We're in a series this summer called Burning Questions, where we've been asking questions about God and faith and scripture. This past Sunday, we talked about the Bible. And one of the questions we didn't get to address that I wanted to take time to do now is who decided what made it into the Bible? I got to say, this is one of the most common questions I hear as a pastor. I think because we live in the post Da Vinci Code era where everyone is convinced that there are all of these amazing, revolutionary books they got left out of the Bible because of people who were power hungry and who wanted, to control the narrative and things like that. And so we talk about the, Council of Nicaea or Constantine or all of those kinds of things. And there's some truth in some of that, but honestly, not very much. And I think the way that we got the Bible, the specific canon of books that we have, is way more interesting and exciting. Uh, because again, it's actually a lot more human, and I think that's beautiful. So let's talk about the Hebrew Bible first. There is a sort of a legend about a council called Jamnia that happened in the first century after Jesus was executed that canonized the Hebrew Bible. We're not actually sure that that ever really happened. There's not a lot of good evidence for it. And it's kind of like a guy heard it from a guy heard it from a guy sort of a thing. What we do know is that by Jesus's day, at least what we call the Torah, the first five books of the Bible, of the Pentateuch of the Torah, and a section of the Hebrew Bible called the prophets were relatively codified. Now, if you're an evangelical like me and you grew up memorizing the books of the Bible, you might think of the prophets as the major prophets and the minor prophets. So the five big prophetic books and then the 12 smaller books. Those are prophetic books. Actually, though, Daniel is not included in there. He's included in a section called the writings. But this also includes a lot of what we call the history books. So, Joshua and I think Judges, and then the First and Second Kings, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Chronicles, like those books all in there. And then everything else gets put in a section called the writings. So if you buy a Hebrew Bible, that's how it's divided up: the law, the prophets, and the writings, or the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And so in Jesus's day, he actually talks about this, right? He talks about, makes references to the law and the prophets. So it seems pretty clear that by Jesus's day, at least those first two groups of books were being used as an authoritative set of books. And it seems as though the writings, which includes, like, again, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs, Ruth, Daniel, Esther, like all those kinds of books, gets kind of gathered up and grouped together and used. They were all being used in this time, but they sort of, again, get codified a little bit after that. Now let's talk about the New Testament. Because again, I think the idea that a lot of people have is that there was some church council at some point that agreed that these are the books we were all going to use, and that's just not how it happened. By the time we see church councils talking about a canon of the New Testament, the canon has actually already been in use for a long time. So the church is sort of just rubber stamping what everyone's already been doing. They didn't like make a new edition and have to go around and take all the Bibles from everyone because they were using these other super cool books that no one wanted them to use anymore. Uh, so again, kind of like what happened with the Hebrew Bible, a lot of the pieces of the New Testament got transmitted in chunks. So, for instance, someone fairly early on started collecting a bunch of the letters that Paul had sent out to all his different churches because they recognized that Paul's wisdom for one church would be applicable somewhere else. There was a little bit of this already happening in Paul. I think it's at the end of one of his letters to the Corinthians. He says, "Hey, when you're done with this letter, give it to the Laodiceans and make sure you get the letter that I sent to them." So yes, there is a Paul's letter to the Laodiceans that for some reason did not get collected, and we don't have it and we don't know what's in it, which is a bummer. That'd be cool to find, right? But it didn't make it in the collection. So someone took, the couple letters to the Thessalonians and to the Corinthians and to the Romans and the Galatians, and they put them all in a little booklet, and then they copied that out, and then they passed it around to churches all over the world. The same thing happened fairly early on with our four gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. There are tons of other gospels. There's the Gospel of Thomas that you've probably heard about. There's the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which talks about Jesus as a little kid, and it's absolutely wild. There's like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, all kinds of other gospels, right? So, and again, churches or like individual congregations would create these and pass them around. No one ever tried to like take them from anyone. What you find then relatively early in the second century is a bunch of church fathers, bishops and elders and pastors who are making lists of different books for the churches. Hey, if you're looking for some script, or if you're looking for some scripture to use in your worship, here are some. And they had three different lists. They had, here are some books that are scripture that we think are scripture. Here are some books that are really good, but probably not scripture, but they're really good. Like today, what we would call, like, a lot of the people use like the Rick Warren books or the Max Lucado books or something like that, right? Those are the kinds of things that we see happening, right? And then they did have books that they were like, stay away from these books. And some of the books, like Gospel of Thomas, ended up on those lists because they they said that they didn't represent the truth of who the whole church understood Jesus to be. So you have all over the world people receiving all of these different groups of books. Then you have all over the world pastors and elders and leaders making lists of these books. Which ones are great, which ones are good, which ones are bad. And this is basically how it goes for like 300 years. You just have churches using these books and figuring out which books, when they use them, does the Spirit consistently meet the congregation in worship. And so I imagine it like a sifter, right? You have like dozens and dozens of books at the start, and the global church just kind of keeps using them in worship and using them in worship and using them in worship. And over a period of a couple of hundred years, the books that end up being our scripture are the books that stay. And there are some that are contentious, like the book of Revelation barely made it into the canon. And in fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they don't really use it. Like, it's in there, but they don't use it any of their liturgies or any of their worship and stuff, which is a shame because if you know me, I love the book of Revelation. I think it's a big bummer that it's not included for the Eastern Orthodox Church. But this is it, right? There are all kinds of different criteria. Like, if they think an apostle wrote it, like Paul's letters or different stuff like that, it had a good chance of making it in. But not every book that was written by an apostle or attributed to an apostle made it in. If it was a book that was written by someone connected to Jesus or that had a really old pedigree, it was likely to make it in. Again, not every book that had an old pedigree made it in. The only thing that every single book that ended up in our New Testament had in common is that the Spirit would work through these texts when the church was gathered to worship. That's it. That's the only thing that every single book all has in common together. And I think that's beautiful because, again, what it shows is that our Bible is primarily not a textbook, not a theology treatise, but a guide for us to encounter Jesus and worship. And I think that's really cool. I think it's actually great that that's how our text came together, that we didn't have a church council or that Jesus didn't like write an autobiography and that's all we use or whatever. So I hope this is helpful. I know this is a question a lot of people have. By the way, all those books that didn't make it in, they're not hidden in a vault in the Vatican somewhere. You can find them on Google. If you ever want to pop by my house, I have copies of just about all of them on my bookshelf. I'm happy to take a look through them, and I think you'll find most of them. You'll find why they didn't make it in. Uh, if you have any more burning questions about how the Bible came together or anything else about Scripture, of course, let us know in the comments. We look forward to seeing you on Sunday for our next burning question. And until then, I'll say grace and peace be with you.